السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد، إن شاء الله تعالى we'll have this session is the 40 hadith of Imam An-Nawawi rahimahullah, and we'll go through inshallah hadith number 30 from the 40 hadith of Imam An-Nawawi rahimahullah. And here's the hadith. The hadith, as you see, it says عن أبي ثعلبة الخشني جرثوم ابن ناشر رضي الله عنه عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: إن الله فرض فرائض فلا تضيعوها، وحد حدودا فلا تعتدوها، وحرم أشياء فلا تنتهكوها، وسكت عن أشياء رحمة لكم غير نسيان فلا تبحثوا عنها. كل حديث حسن رواه الدارقطني وغيره. This hadith, as the rest of the hadith of the 40 hadith of Imam An-Nawawi, one of the comprehensive hadith that sets foundations in matters of the deen, and it's used in many other subjects and parts of knowledge. First of all, and I have here what you see is the sharh, is the explanation of Sheikh Ibrahim rahimahullah. This hadith, going straight to the matna of the hadith of the statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it says, "Inna Allah farada fara'ida fala tudayyuha." That indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fara'id are the obligations. Farad is the verb of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated obligations. And al-fard is the obligation. As we know, the 5 daily salah is called fard. And as he says here, that al-fard is what literally, originally, it means comes something from al-qata', something to be swiftly cut. That means the matter is very clear, is very precise, and it's an obligation. And when sometimes people differentiate between al-fard and al-wajib, they both mean the same thing, which is basically both are obligations. Only among the ahnaf where they make a difference or slight differences between both, but in general both they mean the same thing. But fard is more of a more heavy outcome to it when it comes to the punishment and the reward. Like the 5 daily salah, for example, are called fara'id. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying that indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala farada fara'id. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made fara'id obligations. فَلَا تُضَيِّعُوهَا. Do not تُضَيِّعُوهَا. Do not neglect it. Do not, as he says, تُهْمِلُوهَا فَتَضِيعُ. That when you make something, or ضَيَعُ الشَّيْء is something when it's lost. So don't lose it. Basically, fulfill the obligations the way it ought to be. فَلَا تُضَيِّعُوهَا. وَحَدَّ حُدُودًا فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. And he made had, or had, the same thing. The hudud are the limits. The had is the verb of it, the verb of the word hudud. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made hudud, or he set limits. فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. Do not transgress it. Al-i'tida is to transgress. And the hudud are limits, and the limits are slightly different than what the fard is. And the limit literally means something that is prevented. You have a limit, you have sanctuary, you have an area where it's surrounded by a fence that you're not supposed to go across it or to go transgress it. So there are limits to many things, whether it's the punishments that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set for specific crimes that is committed, like zina and stealing and so on. And the same thing when it comes to the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set for every act of worship. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talked about eating and drinking while fasting, he said, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. These are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do not transgress it, do not go beyond it. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated fasting upon you with specific limits. So do not transgress the limits. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talked about al-idda after divorce and the rulings to be applied in it, He said, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَقْرَبُوهَا. These are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so do not approach it. So there are two acts of worship with regards to the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set. Do not transgress it and do not approach it. Some things you do not come close to it. Otherwise, if you come close to the limit, it's very easy to transgress. And that's also the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that we talked about it before, about for every malik, لِكُلِّ مَلِكٍ حِمَى. For every malik, for every king, there's a sanctuary, forbidden area. So do not come close to it. So this has many rulings in it, again, as we said, and it applies to certain acts of worship, the haram and the halal and things like this. وحرم, then he said, وحرم أشياء فلا تنتهكوها. وحرم أشياء, and he forbade أشياء, أشياء, the plural of شيء. He forbade things in the plural tense. فلا تنتهكوها. Do not do it, basically. And انتهاك الشيء is when you break something. So do not break the orders of Allah. Do not. The haram is basically, as it's mentioned in other hadith, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala covered the hellfire with desires. So in the sense, like if a person breaks that seal of the hellfire, he will enter the hellfire. So فَلَا تَنْتَهِكُوهَا, do not break the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and indulge into the haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade certain things by the wisdom of Allah and His mercy subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَسَكَتَ عَنْ أَشْيَاء, and then the next statement, وَسَكَتَ عَنْ أَشْيَاءَ رَحْمَةً لَكُمْ غَيْرَ نِسْيَانٍ فَلَا تَبْحَثُوا عَنْهَا. وَسَكَتَ عَنْ أَشْيَاء. Sakata, that means he was silent with regards to some things, أشياء, رَحْمَةً لَكُمْ, out of His mercy towards you. Some things are not mentioned, whether it's halal or haram, and it's there for a reason. غَيْرَ نِسْيَانٍ, not that he forgot to mention it. فَلَا تَبْحَثُوا عَنْهَا, do not look for it, do not search for it, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not leave it out of ignorance, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, but it's because of the wisdom of Allah and the knowledge of Allah. So He did not make it an obligation, He did not forbade it for you. And that's why there are foundations and principles with regards to this. First of all, it states that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forget, so everything in the deen is completed, is perfect. And nobody is to think, for example, why this particular matter is not made clearer or less clearer or more or whatever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completed the religion. So either the person is ignorant about the rulings of the deen, and many times this is the case when the deen is clear about a matter but the person doesn't have the knowledge of it, or it's meant to be this way. It's meant to be this way for great reason, for the people to maybe struggle more harder, to struggle with their own selves, to stay away from what is not been given, whether it's an obligation or something that is forbidden. Not knowing the outcome of one's actions, sometimes this is something that is not mentioned, so that people would submit themselves fully to the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like many hadith or even verses of the Quran that talks about what's forbidden, and people would want to know the wisdom behind it, for example, or what happens if we do this, things might get worse, things of that nature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He will, He would have made it very clear to the people that this is why it's forbidden, this is why it's good, or this is why it's bad. But sometimes things are not mentioned for people to submit themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As you see from the hadith, that it shows that everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'm going through the benefits that the Sheikh rahimahullah mentioned, that to establish the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that obligates and the one that forbids, and that's why people need to humble themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is not for the human beings to make permissible or non-permissible, but the things has to be from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, one of the benefits that we learned that there are levels of deeds. There are obligations, there are haram, there are recommended acts, things that are makruh or disliked. And it's important to know these levels of deeds so that the person know what to put first and what to put second and what to stay away from. And that's a knowledge, it's a mandatory knowledge. And the more the person gains knowledge, the more that he would do the best of the deeds. And especially when there are so many good deeds out there, a person choose one or the other, which one to choose. And that's what it comes to the knowledge of knowing the maratib or the levels of the deeds. And the same thing with haram. A person, for example, in a specific situation, he has to do one or two of haram things. To choose the lesser haram is part of what the deen calls the people to do. And it's not something left for the desires for a person to say, well, I have to do one of the two haram. It might be the solution is to stay away from all of the haram. But in some situations, especially with matters of necessities, and that requires knowledge. As you see how the exalting the orders of Allah, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made an obligation, that means how the words are used. فَلَا تُضَيِّعُوهَا, do not lose it. That means you have to be upon it, you have to do it in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to be or to do it. And the hudud and the limits, the same way that people set limits for the lands and they don't allow anybody to transgress the limits, the same thing, there are limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said for people not to transgress. And it shows out, especially like the verse that we mentioned about marriage and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned these limits, marriage and divorces and things like this. Also one of the benefits that we learn, that if something that is not mentioned in the religion clearly, it's meant to be this way. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, He would have said something in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and that's the subject also of bid'ah, innovations in the deen. Matters of aqidah, for example, names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If something is not mentioned, it's not mentioned for a reason. So people should stop where the knowledge make them stop, and not to indulge into their own thinking and their own false principles and so on. Like the mas'alat al-kayf, how the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are, we do not know the how. There's the how to it, but we do not know it. That's where we stop. We know the attribute, what it means. We believe in it. We do not deny it. We do not distort it. We do not explain it in our own ways and desires, but to leave the matter the way it is without making similarities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to not get into the subjects or the matter that has not been revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So if this hadith is calling us to learn what is halal and what is haram, yes, and we should learn that, and that's the subject of the deen. And we should learn what are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's major or minor, everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to learn, we should, even in matters of relationships, in matters of sunan al-fitra, even for the hair and facial hair, what to do with it. As there's religion there, whether it's beards or men, not to plug the eyebrows for women and of course men, and many other things. And this is just an example to show that in everything that we have in our life, there are limits to be observed, there are obligations to be observed, there are haram things to stay away from. And either a person has the knowledge of it or to ask the people of knowledge. And even though the companions radiallahu anhum, they were forbidden from asking at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, because the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was coming down. But after the revelation is ceased, then it's important for people to ask. But not to ask nonsense questions, that things that not pertain to their situations or the reality that they face, but rather to ask for what is benefiting for them and what's halal and what's haram, so that they submit themselves to the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We will stop here inshallah ta'ala, and this is again very brief, but as all of these hadith, we should always refer to it when it comes to the matters of the deen and halal and haram and things of that nature. بارك الله فيكم. جزاكم الله خير. صلى الله عليه وسلم. بارك الله عليه وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.